The world was ending, but the memo hadn't reached Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton's office. Not yet. Outside, the sky over Pearl Harbor was being torn apart by Japanese aircraft. The air, usually thick with the scent of salt and plumeria, now tasted of cordite and burning oil. The very foundations of the submarine base headquarters trembled with the percussive, world-shattering thump of torpedoes finding the soft hulls of battleships. But inside Layton's stuffy, windowless intelligence office, the nerve center of the Pacific Fleet's brain, the war was still an abstraction, a blizzard of paper. Reports flooded his desk, a chaotic avalanche of frantic, contradictory information. A midget sub sighted off the harbor mouth. Paratroopers landing on Ford Island. A second attack wave forming over Barber's Point. Most of it was noise, the predictable hysteria of a surprise attack. Layton's job, his entire purpose for being, was to find the signal in that noise. He was a human filter, tasked with separating the phantom from the fact, with seeing the enemy's mind, not just the flashes of his guns. He stood over a massive chart of Oahu, his hands steady, his face a mask of intense concentration, trying to build a coherent picture from the fragments of chaos. Then, a runner burst through the door, his face pale, his uniform streaked with soot. He didn't say a word. He just handed Layton a single sheet of flimsy paper, a damage control report from the Navy Yard, and fled. Layton's eyes scanned the typed lines. USS Arizona, catastrophic explosion. USS Oklahoma, capsized. USS West Virginia, sinking at her moorings. It was the confirmation of a nightmare. But as his gaze drifted down the page, his mind, trained for 2 decades to find the thing that does not belong, snagged on a detail. It was a single, almost trivial line item tucked beneath the apocalyptic headlines of dying dreadnoughts. Report of targeted bomb hits on Dry Dock No. 1. And another, just below it, sustained strafing runs on Yard Machine Shop Complex. It made no sense. It was a tactical absurdity. Why would a pilot, with the entire U.S. battle line sitting helpless before him like a row of sleeping giants, waste a single bomb, a single bullet, on a workshop? It was like a tiger, in the middle of killing a buffalo, stopping to swat at a fly on its flank. It was inefficient. It was illogical. And in that moment, as the building shuddered from another nearby explosion, Edwin Layton felt the first, cold whisper of a truth far more terrifying than the inferno-consuming Battleship Row. He was staring at the first clue in an investigation that no one else even knew had begun. The official story was writing itself in real time, in columns of black smoke and the screams of dying men. It was a simple, brutal, and horrifyingly clear narrative. The Japanese objective, brilliant in its execution and devastating in its success, was the complete annihilation of the U.S. battleship force. The plan on paper, conceived in Tokyo, was to deliver a knockout blow so severe, so psychologically shattering, that America would be forced to sue for peace, leaving the Pacific uncontested for a decade. And as the reports flooded in, Arizona gone, a funeral pyre for 1,000 souls, Oklahoma capsized, her hull turned to the sky like a dead whale, West Virginia, and California settling on the bottom, that narrative seemed terrifyingly complete. The plan had met reality, and reality had surrendered. The investigation, for all intents and purposes, seemed over before it began. They came for the battleships. They got the battleships. End of story. But in the fog of war, the real truth rarely arrives with the first wave of explosions. It hides in the margins of after-action reports, in the confused testimony of a smoke-blinded sailor, in the small, seemingly insignificant details that don't fit the grand, terrible narrative. And for Layton, that initial contradiction, the workshop and the dry dock, was a loose thread. He began to pull. As his team collated the damage reports, the strange and unsettling pattern grew. Another report came in, even stranger than the first. Multiple pilots had reported Japanese planes making low, aggressive passes over the giant oil tank farms that lined the ridge above the harbor, their tanks holding 4.5 million barrels of crude oil, the lifeblood of the entire Pacific Fleet. They hadn't dropped bombs, not in any concentrated way, but they had examined it, strafed it, marked it. Imagine a chess master sacrificing his queen to take his opponents. That's what the attack on Battleship Row looked like. But Layton was seeing something else. He was seeing the enemy, after taking the queen, also spending precious time and resources to knock over the pawn in front of the king, to attack the rook in the corner, to try and break the little wooden squares of the board itself. Why would a pilot, with the Nevada making a heroic run for the open sea, waste a single second strafing a workshop? Unless the workshop was a target of equal, or perhaps even greater, importance. Layton stood before his map of Oahu, pinning colored flags to denote strikes. The cluster over Battleship Row was a bloody, predictable crimson. But he then began placing blue flags, one on the dry docks, one on the machine shops, one on the power station, a ring of them around the tank farm. A new picture began to form, a ghost image superimposed over the fiery portrait of destruction everyone else was seeing. He turned to a subordinate, his voice low and urgent, a stark contrast to the shouting that echoed from the chaos of SinkPack headquarters down the hall. They weren't just sinking ships, he murmured, his finger tracing a line connecting the blue flags. They were trying to tear out the heart of the base. They were trying to poison the well. He took his preliminary findings to a senior staff officer, a man whose eyes were hollow with the shock of losing friends and flagships. Layton pointed to the map, his voice tight with the dawning horror of his discovery. Captain, the target wasn't just the fleet. It was the base itself, the infrastructure, the repair facilities, the fuel. If they had hit those tanks. The captain cut him off, his hand waving dismissively at the map. For God's sake, Layton, look outside. They've broken our back. They've killed 1,000 of our friends. Are you suggesting we should have been guarding an oil drum instead of the USS Arizona? Pull yourself together. Don't distract yourself with workshops when the battle line is sitting on the bottom of the harbor. The official explanation had hardened into dogma in less than 3 hours. But Layton felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the sunken ships. He knew, with an investigator's certainty, that he was looking at the evidence of a second, far more insidious attack plan. And the most terrifying part wasn't that the Japanese had executed it. It was that, for some reason, they had failed to complete it. He was staring at the ghost of a wound that could have been instantly fatal, and absolutely no one else in command could see it. Let's step away from the smoke and the chaos of the harbor for a moment. Let's leave the shouting men in the command center and enter the quiet, almost monastic stillness of Layton's mind. Because to understand the terror that was now gripping him, you have to understand the single, brutal God that governs all warfare in the Pacific geography. The map in his office wasn't just a piece of paper, it was a blueprint of impossibility. The Pacific Ocean is not a battlefield. It's a desert of water, an expanse of hostile emptiness so vast it defies human comprehension. On that map, the United States mainland was a distant continent, and the coast of Japan was a world away. And in between, there was almost nothing. Nothing, except a single, tiny, indispensable pinprick of land, Oahu. This is where we need a war college briefing. Imagine you're planning to climb Mount Everest. Your team, your supplies, your entire life's ambition are gathered in a town at the foot of the mountain. That town is California. The peak of Everest, the goal, is Tokyo. You can't just walk from the town to the summit in one go. It's impossible. You need a base camp, a high-altitude sanctuary where you can acclimatize, repair your equipment, stockpile your oxygen, and launch your final assault. Without that base camp, you will die on the mountain. Your expedition is doomed before it even begins. Pearl Harbor was America's base camp Everest. It was the only deep-water naval station, the only major repair facility, the only fuel depot for thousands of miles in any direction. Every warship, every carrier, every submarine that hoped to project American power towards the Philippines, towards Wake Island, towards Japan itself, was utterly dependent on that single, vulnerable Hawaiian port. The battleships anchored in the harbor were the elite climbers, resting before their ascent. But the base itself, the dry docks, the machine shops, the power grid, and most critically, those enormous, thin-skinned fuel tanks was the base camp. It was the entire reason the climbers could even be there. And in that quiet office, with the faint smell of burning oil seeping through the windows, Edwin Layton was realizing the horrifying truth. The Japanese hadn't just attacked the climbers. They had sent their best men to destroy the base camp. He stared at the list of secondary targets again. The machine shops held the only heavy-duty lathes and presses capable of repairing a warped propeller shaft or a damaged rudder west of San Diego. Without them, A crippled ship was a dead ship. Dry dock number 1 was one of the few places a capital ship could be lifted from the water to fix a torpedo gash in its hull, destroy it, and the wounded would have no hospital. But the oil god, the oil. Those 48 tanks on the ridge held the distilled kinetic energy of the entire fleet. 4.5 million barrels. It was enough fuel to wage a year of war. It was also, Layton knew from a dozen forgotten engineering reports, catastrophically vulnerable. A few well-placed bombs from a high-altitude Kate, and the entire farm would go up in a chain reaction, a volcanic eruption of fire and smoke that would burn for days. The resulting river of burning oil would flow downhill, straight into the harbor, incinerating everything it touched: piers, submarines, rescue vessels, and any surviving ships. It wouldn't just be a wound. It would be a chemical cauterization of America's ability to fight. The fleet, what was left of it, would have been forced to turn tail and run. Not to a nearby island, but 2,400 miles back to San Diego, leaving the Central Pacific a strategic vacuum. Wake Island, Guam, the Philippines, they would fall, their garrison stranded, their calls for help fading into the silence of a Japanese-owned ocean. The war would be over before it had a chance to begin, lost not in a clash of fleets, but by a simple act of logistical arson. This was the ghost attack plan Layton saw, a plan to transform a tactical victory into a strategic checkmate. He looked at the reports of Japanese planes circling the tank farms, of pilots strafing the machine shops. These weren't random acts of violence. This was a targeted assassination of the base's vital organs. The mystery was no longer what the Japanese were trying to do. The evidence was undeniable. The mystery was now infinitely more terrifying. Why had they stopped? With the heart of American naval power exposed and utterly defenseless, why did the final, fatal blow never land? He had to know. He had to convince Kimmel, Nimitz, anyone who would listen, that they weren't investigating a defeat. They were standing on the edge of a cliff, and they needed to understand, with absolute certainty, why the enemy hadn't given them that final push. A theory, no matter how brilliant, is just a ghost in a briefing room. It has no weight. It cannot stop a bullet or launch a ship. Edwin Layton knew this. His terrifying vision of a decapitated Pearl Harbor, a Pacific fleet cast adrift without its life support, was just a phantom haunting the edges of the official narrative. To make it real, to force the admirals to see the cliff edge they were all standing on, he needed proof. He needed a piece of the enemy's mind, a tangible artifact dragged from the wreckage of their attack. And so, while the senior staff wrestled with the monumental task of counting their dead and assessing the damage to the fleet, Layton launched a different kind of mission. He turned his intelligence unit from analysts into battlefield detectives. Their grim jurisdiction was the fresh crash sites scattered across Oahu, the twisted, smoking carcasses of Japanese aircraft that had been clawed from the sky by the island's furious, last-gasp anti-aircraft fire. He sent his men out in jeeps, with a simple, urgent directive: ignore the bodies, ignore the machine guns. Find the paperwork. Find the charts, the logbooks, the kneeboard notes, anything that could serve as a Rosetta Stone for the Japanese plan. It was a desperate search for a single clue amidst the chaos, a hunt for a single page of truth in a library of fire and twisted metal. For hours, the reports that came back were useless. Wreckage too mangled, documents incinerated on impact. Then, a call came in from a cane field near Wahiawa. A young ensign, his voice crackling with a mixture of shock and excitement, had found something in the cockpit of a shattered Aichi Val dive bomber. It was a dent-proof metal chart case, miraculously thrown clear of the main fire. An hour later, that case was on Layton's desk. The air in the room seemed to grow thin as he pried open the warped lid. Inside, nestled in oil-stained canvas, was a sheaf of papers. It was a pilot's targeting packet. The first page was a master map of Pearl Harbor, grid with precise, meticulous lines, a beautiful and terrible blueprint for demolition. And on it, Layton saw the first piece of hard, undeniable evidence. The primary targets, the 8 battleships moored along Ford Island, were circled in thick, aggressive red ink. Each ship was marked, identified, prioritized. This was the plan everyone already knew: the bloody, successful assault on the battle line. But Layton's eyes, trained to find the anomaly, scanned the rest of the partially burnt map. And there it was. Scattered across the chart were smaller, secondary markings, these in precise, deliberate black ink. They weren't hazy suggestions, they were designated targets. One symbol was placed squarely over the Navy Yard's main machine shop complex. Another hovered directly over dry dock number 1. A third was a bracket, a chilling embrace drawn around the entire cluster of oil storage tanks on the ridge. It was his ghost theory, given form in enemy ink. It was the whisper from the margins, now screaming from the page. This wasn't a contingency plan. The detail was too specific, the grid coordinates too precise. This was an integral part of the mission. The Japanese hadn't just come to sink the fleet, they had come to systematically disembowel the base. He and his team stared at the map, the sense of grim vindication mixing with a new, colder fear. The proof was right here. They had been spared a death blow not by their own strength, but by some unknown failure on the part of the enemy. The investigation had its first, crucial clue. It felt like a breakthrough, a moment of brilliant sunshine piercing the suffocating fog of war. But as Layton's intelligence chief, a man who could read Japanese, looked closer at the final page of the packet of blood-stained, partially preserved checklist of timings and objectives, the sunshine vanished, replaced by a darker and more profound mystery. He pointed a trembling finger at the bottom of the list. "Commander," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Look at this." Below the entries for the first wave and the second wave, there was a third entry. It was an attack phase designated Wave 3. The target column listed coordinates that corresponded perfectly with the black markings on the map, the machine shops, the dry docks, and the tank farm. And next to it, in the timing column, was a single, stark notation: 1,000 hours. It was an order for a final, decisive strike, a third wave of bombers scheduled to arrive an hour after the second. It was an attack order for a wave of aircraft that had, for some inexplicable reason, simply vanished from the sky. The discovery of the targeting packet should have been a moment of triumph. Layton and his team had found the smoking gun, the undeniable proof of the enemy's broader, more sinister strategic design. The third wave was no longer a theory, it was a ghost with a name, a target list, and a scheduled time of arrival. He took the evidence straight up the chain of command, his sense of urgency burning like a fever. He laid the captured map on Admiral Kimmel's temporary desk, the black-inked circles around the base's vital organs looking like death sentences awaiting a signature. He pointed to the checklist, to the stark, chilling entry for the 1,000-hour strike. "Admiral," he said, his voice strained, "this is what they were really after. The battleships were just the opening act. This was meant to be the killing blow. But the human mind, especially a mind under the immense pressure of catastrophic failure, has a powerful immune system. It rejects information that is too complex, too terrifying, or that contradicts the simple, overwhelming reality of the moment." Admiral Kimmel looked at the map, his face etched with a grief so profound it seemed to have aged him a decade in a single morning. He saw the red circles, the symbols of his lost ships and his dead men. The black circles seemed faint, theoretical. The official story, now being screamed by newspaper headlines across the mainland, was a powerful narcotic. It was a story of a brilliant, devastating, but ultimately conventional naval strike. It was a tragedy he could understand. Layton's theory was something else entirely. It suggested an enemy of almost supernatural cunning, an enemy whose failure was more terrifying than their success. "It's a contingency plan," Layton, one of Kimmel's aides, argued, his voice sharp with exhaustion and denial. "Every good plan has contingencies. They hit the primary targets so effectively they didn't need a third wave. They're already on their way back to Japan, celebrating." Another officer chimed in. "Maybe the pilots in that plane just had a different briefing. We're looking at one piece of paper from one downed aircraft. It's not definitive." The system was pushing back. The promising lead, the hard evidence, was being dismissed as an anomaly, an outlier. The official explanation was a fortress, and Layton was throwing pebbles at its walls. He was no longer a hopeful explorer who had found a new continent. He was a critic, a Cassandra, whose warnings were being interpreted as a distraction from the main effort: rescue, salvage, and the grim accounting of their losses. The lead hadn't just gone cold, it was being deliberately packed in ice. The true genius of the enemy, however, wasn't just in their planning. It was in the psychological shockwave their attack had created. The Japanese had done more than sink ships, they had shattered the confidence of American command. They had created a paralysis of the imagination. In that moment, the leadership in Pearl Harbor couldn't conceive of an enemy bold enough to linger, to press their advantage. Fear, the great multiplier of the fog of war, began to dictate their thinking. The dominant theory became that the third wave wasn't meant for the tank farms, but for the American aircraft carriers, the Enterprise and Lexington, which had been blessedly at sea and were now steaming back towards Oahu. The absence of the third wave wasn't a mystery, it was a sign that the Japanese were regrouping, rearming, and waiting to ambush America's most valuable remaining assets. The ghost on the map was now seen as a hunter, lurking just over the horizon. This new, fear-based theory had an immediate and catastrophic effect. It inverted the investigation. Instead of trying to understand why the Japanese hadn't finished the job, the entire focus of SINCPAC shifted to surviving the next imagined blow. Patrol planes were sent on sprawling, desperate searches for an enemy fleet that wasn't there. The precious few remaining fighters were held back to defend against a phantom attack wave. The mystery of the missing third wave was being buried under the enemy's most effective weapon, the terror they had instilled in the hearts of their opponents. Layton was back at square one, but worse. He wasn't just confused, he was being actively ignored, his investigation deemed irrelevant. He was a man shouting a fire warning in a building that was already half burnt to the ground, and the fire chief was telling him to stop worrying about sparks and help count the dead. The truth wasn't just hidden, it was now politically and emotionally inconvenient. Days turned into a week. The official narrative solidified, carved in stone by Admiral Kimmel's dismissal and the congressional inquiries that followed. The story of Pearl Harbor became a story of American unpreparedness and Japanese treachery, centered entirely on the sunken battle wagons. Layton's theory of the third wave, the ghost attack on the base's infrastructure, was relegated to a footnote in his own private reports, a nagging, unresolved question that haunted him while the rest of the Navy moved on to the titanic task of fighting a global war. The investigation was, for all intents and purposes, dead. The trail had gone completely cold, buried under the rubble of recriminations and the urgent demands of a nation now at war. And then, as it so often does in the annals of history, the breakthrough came from a place no one was looking. It didn't come from a captured document or a high-level defector. It came from a silent, invisible world that existed in the crackle and hiss of the radio waves. It came from Station Hypo. Station Hypo was a windowless, soundproofed basement on the Pearl Harbor base, a concrete tomb known to its inhabitants as the Dungeon. It was the nerve center for American signals intelligence in the Pacific, a place where a small, brilliant, and deeply eccentric team of cryptanalysts waged a secret war against the Japanese Imperial Navy's codes. Their leader was a commander named Joseph Rockefort, a man who famously preferred to work in his slippers and smoking jacket, a maverick genius who understood that the enemy's greatest secrets weren't hidden in their safes, but in the patterns of their radio traffic. While the rest of the Navy was counting ships, Rockefort's team was counting signals, analyzing call signs, and mapping the invisible web of communications that tied the Japanese fleet together. In the frantic days after the attack, Rockefort's team was working without sleep, fueled by coffee and a burning need for redemption. They had failed to predict the attack on Pearl Harbor, a failure that would shadow them for the rest of their lives. Now, their mission was singular: find the Japanese fleet, the Kido Butai, the six-carrier strike force that had vanished as completely as it had appeared. For weeks, they listened to the silence. The ether was dead. The Japanese, masters of radio discipline, had gone completely dark after the attack. There was nothing to intercept, nothing to decrypt. It was like trying to hunt a submarine in an ocean of ink. Then, in late December, a flicker. A junior analyst, a young man with a gift for recognizing the fist, the unique rhythmic signature of individual Japanese radio operators, picked up a faint, coded signal from the mid-Pacific. It was a known operator, one he recognized from the traffic logs before the attack. A few days later, another signal, from a different operator, but using a similar call sign structure. The signals were short, routine, and encrypted in a low-grade code the Japanese used for administrative messages. But to Rockefort, they were everything. The enemy was talking again. He put his entire team on it. Ignoring the high-level strategic codes, they focused on this seemingly mundane garbage traffic. And slowly, painstakingly, They began to piece together a new, impossible picture. Using radio direction finding, they triangulated the source of the signals. They weren't coming from a single point. They were coming from multiple points, scattered across the Central Pacific. And when Rockefort plotted those points on his master chart, his blood ran cold. The signals were coming from the same locations as the pre-attack radio traffic of the Kido Butai. The carriers weren't on their way back to Japan to celebrate. They hadn't vanished. They were still out there, prowling the vast emptiness of the Pacific, their flight decks rearmed, their pilots ready. The hunter that Sinkpak had feared was real after all. He finally had its location. But as his team decrypted one of the low-grade messages, a simple logistics request for replacement parts for a specific type of bomb fused the true purpose of their lingering presence was revealed. And it had nothing to do with the Enterprise or the Lexington. The bomb fuse type was one used exclusively for land attack, high-explosive ordnance. The kind of bomb you use to demolish concrete buildings and rupture steel tanks. It was the ordnance of the missing third wave. They weren't waiting to ambush the American carriers. They were waiting for a new set of orders. Orders to come back and finish the job. Rockefort now held the two pieces of the puzzle that no one else had: Edwin Layton's captured map showing the intent to destroy the base, and now the raw signals intelligence showing the enemy's continued capability and proximity to do so. The ghost of the third wave wasn't a memory of a failed attack. It was a clear and present danger. A loaded gun still pointed directly at the heart of Pearl Harbor. Armed with Rockefort's explosive intelligence, Layton felt a jolt of adrenaline he hadn't experienced since the morning of the attack. This was it. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the corroborating evidence that elevated his theory from a plausible hypothesis to a terrifying, actionable truth. The captured map was the enemy's playbook. The radio intercepts were their live chatter from the huddle. They hadn't retreated. They hadn't celebrated. They had lingered, rearmed with the very munitions needed to execute the base-destroying third wave, waiting just over the horizon. The investigation had been resurrected from the dead by the ghost catchers in Station Hypo's dungeon. Layton and Rockefort prepared their joint briefing for the new Sinkpak commander, Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz was a different man from Kimmel. Where Kimmel had been shattered by the attack, Nimitz had been sent by Roosevelt to pick up the pieces. He was calm, analytical, and possessed a mind that was open to uncomfortable truths. Layton felt a surge of hope. This time, they would be heard. This time, the system would listen. They stood before Nimitz in his office, the same office where Kimmel had presided over the death of his fleet. The air was still heavy with the ghosts of that day. Layton laid out the narrative, step by logical step. He began with the anomaly, the strange, seemingly inefficient attacks on the workshops and dry docks. He presented the captured pilot's map, the black circles a stark indictment of the enemy's true intentions. He explained the strategic calculus, using the base camp Everest analogy to illustrate how the destruction of the fuel farms and repair facilities would have been a far greater victory for Japan than the sinking of a dozen battleships. He was building a case, brick by brick, laying a foundation of irrefutable logic. Then, Rockefort stepped forward for the climax. He presented the signals intelligence, the charts showing the Kido Butai still prowling the Central Pacific, the decrypted messages requesting land attack ordnance. He connected the dots with devastating precision. Admiral, he concluded, his voice steady but laced with the gravity of his discovery, the third wave wasn't aborted. It was postponed. Nagumo's fleet didn't return to Japan because their primary mission wasn't complete. They were waiting for confirmation that our carriers were not a threat, at which point they would return to finish Pearl Harbor permanently. A heavy silence fell over the room. Layton watched Nimitz's face, searching for a sign of acceptance, of dawning comprehension. The Admiral stared at the map, his gaze fixed on the cluster of oil tanks. The logic was unassailable. The evidence was overwhelming. They had finally, painstakingly, pieced together the enemy's grand design. But as the truth settled in the room, it brought with it a far more dangerous and politically toxic question. It was one of Nimitz's staff officers who dared to voice it. He cleared his throat, his face pale. Admiral, he began, choosing his words with extreme care. If this is true, if the Japanese were rearming for a second strike, and our own intelligence believed they were retreating, that means for nearly 2 weeks, we were. He couldn't finish the sentence. Layton finished it for him. the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Completely and utterly defenseless. This was the uncomfortable truth, the revelation that went far beyond enemy intentions. It was a dagger pointed directly at the heart of the American command structure. It implied a catastrophic failure of intelligence analysis in the immediate aftermath of the attack. It meant that while SyncPac was obsessing over a phantom carrier ambush, the real threat, the complete and permanent annihilation of their only strategic base in the Pacific, was being ignored. It suggested that if the Japanese High Command had given the order, there would have been nothing to stop them from returning and turning Oahu into a smoking, uninhabitable rock. The victory of discovering the truth was instantly eclipsed by the horror of what that truth implied. It wasn't a story of a clever enemy who had simply gotten away. It was the story of a catastrophic American miscalculation, a failure to understand the nature of the war they were now in. This wasn't just a military investigation anymore. It was an inquest into their own incompetence. And in the middle of a war for national survival, that was the most dangerous truth of all. The atmosphere in Admiral Nimitz's office shifted instantly. The intellectual excitement of discovery, the pure, clean thrill of solving the enemy's puzzle, curdled into something dense and poisonous. It was the smell of blame. Layton and Rockefort had arrived as investigators delivering a critical warning. They were now perceived as accusers delivering a verdict. The truth they had uncovered was no longer a shield to protect the future, but a mirror reflecting the failures of the past. And the system, with the primal instinct of any large organism, began to push back, not with anger, but with the cold, crushing weight of bureaucratic necessity. Admiral Nimitz, a pragmatist above all else, understood the implications immediately. He saw the branching paths of this revelation, and none of them led anywhere good. If he were to officially accept and circulate Layton and Rockefort's findings, he would be forced to concede that for the first crucial weeks of the war, American command in the Pacific had been operating under a complete and fatal misapprehension of the enemy's strategy. He would be admitting that the base, and by extension the entire war effort, had been saved not by American foresight or strength, but by the enemy's indecision. This wasn't just an embarrassment. It was a weapon. In Washington, the political knives were already out over the Pearl Harbor disaster. Admirals were being fired, careers were being destroyed, and a narrative was being constructed for public consumption, a story of American heroism in the face of a treacherous sneak attack. The idea that the day of infamy could have been followed by a fortnight of incompetence was politically radioactive. It would sow doubt, shatter morale, and provide ammunition to the enemies of the Navy who were already circling. An aide, a captain with a politician's sense for danger, voiced the official pushback. "Admiral," he said, his tone carefully neutral, "Commander Layton and Commander Rockefort have presented a compelling, but ultimately speculative, reconstruction. We have a single captured map and a handful of low-grade intercepts. To rewrite our entire understanding of the attack based on this, it's a leap. The Japanese fleet did withdraw, after all. That is the one undeniable fact. Their reasons for doing so are, at this point, academic." Academic. The word hung in the air, a perfect little hand grenade of dismissal. It was the bureaucrat's ultimate weapon, a way of framing a life-or-death reality as a trivial point of historical debate. Another officer added the finishing touch. "Our focus, sir, must be forward-looking. We need to focus on taking the fight to the enemy, not on relitigating the last one. The men need to believe we are moving forward, not looking back." Nimitz was trapped. He knew, with the cold certainty of a seasoned commander, that Layton and Rockefort were right. The logic was sound. But he was also a political animal, charged with holding the entire Pacific theater together with little more than willpower and a handful of carriers. He could not afford a crisis of confidence in his own command staff. He could not afford to send a report to Washington that said, in essence, "We were blind, deaf, and dumb, and got lucky." So he made a decision. It was the pragmatic choice, the leader's choice, and in its own way, a brutal one. He turned to Layton and Rockefort. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument, "your work has been exemplary. The intelligence you've gathered will be instrumental in helping us understand the enemy's mindset for future operations." He paused, letting the faint praise land before delivering the blow. "However, this investigation is now closed. Your report will be classified at the highest level and filed for post-war analysis. Your teams are to be commended and then immediately reassigned. Rockefort, I need you and every mind you have in that dungeon focused on finding the Keto Butai's next move. Layton, I need you to build me a picture of Japanese intentions for the South Pacific. That is all. It was a masterful execution. He didn't question their facts. He didn't call them liars. He validated their work and then buried it alive in a classified file. They weren't being punished, they were being retasked for the good of the war effort. They were given a direct order to stand down, to cease their investigation, and to move on. The system wasn't just pushing back, it had won. Layton and Rockefort walked out of Nimitz's headquarters not as heroes who had uncovered a vital truth, but as custodians of a dangerous secret, silenced by the very institution they were trying to save. This was the bottom. For an investigator, there is no lower place than to hold the proven, documented truth in your hands and be ordered to call it a lie. Layton and Rockefort had descended into the fog of war, navigated its treacherous currents, and returned with the enemy's battle plan in their hands, only to have it snatched away and locked in a filing cabinet. They were no longer investigators, they were librarians of a forbidden history, their warnings silenced, their discovery rendered impotent. The personal cost was immense. They were isolated, forced to carry the weight of what they knew in a command structure that had officially declared their knowledge irrelevant. They had to sit in briefings, listen to strategies being formed based on the flawed, official understanding of the enemy, and say nothing. It was a unique and exquisite form of intellectual torture. The disaster they had tried to prevent, or rather, the disaster they had revealed could have happened, was now irrevocably set in motion, not as an enemy action, but as a flaw in their own strategic DNA. The American war machine, believing the core lesson of Pearl Harbor was about defending ships, began to pour its resources into exactly that. Naval doctrine, fleet deployments, and coastal defenses were all reoriented around the idea of preventing another surprise attack on the fleet. The deeper, more vital lesson that the true center of gravity was not the warships, but the logistical base that supported them was lost. The ghost of the third wave, the attack that never was, had been exorcised from the official memory. And because that lesson went unlearned, the stage was set for it to be taught again, this time not by a phantom, but in blood and fire. The narrative shifts now, away from the quiet offices of Pearl Harbor, forward in time by 5 crucial months, to the turquoise waters and steaming jungles of the Coral Sea. The American Navy, having fought a desperate holding action across the Pacific, finally had a chance to strike a real blow. The Japanese were advancing on Port Moresby in New Guinea, a move that would threaten Australia itself. Admiral Nimitz, using Rockefort's still brilliant intelligence, knew they were coming. He dispatched the carriers Lexington and Yorktown to intercept. The ensuing battle was a strange and revolutionary new kind of warfare, fought entirely by aircraft. The opposing fleets never saw each other. It was a blindfolded boxing match, with pilots serving as the fists, searching for an enemy they could only locate through radio intercepts and scout plane sightings. In the chaos of the battle, the Japanese carrier Shoho was sunk, a major victory. But the Japanese struck back. Their planes found the American task force. And when they attacked, their pilots, trained in the same school as the Pearl Harbor veterans, demonstrated that they had not forgotten the lessons their commanders had. They did not just target the American carriers. While one group of bombers swarmed the Lexington, another group, with chilling precision, went after a different target. They ignored the cruisers, they ignored the destroyers. They flew straight for the USS Neosho, a fleet oiler, and its escort, the destroyer USS. The Battle of the Coral Sea was a brutal, bloody lesson, but it was only the prelude. The final, horrifying exam was just a few weeks away. The architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, was a gambler. But he was a gambler who hated leaving a job unfinished. He knew, with a strategic clarity that had eluded his American counterparts, that the decapitation of Pearl Harbor had failed. The American carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and the miraculously salvaged and repaired Yorktown were still out there, prowling the Pacific. They were a knife held to the throat of his expanding empire, and he intended to remove it. His plan was a masterpiece of complexity and ambition. He would lure the American fleet into a decisive battle at a tiny, strategically vital atoll called Midway. But this time, there would be no mistakes. This time, the third wave would not be left to chance. Yamamoto's plan wasn't just to sink the American carriers, it was to invade and occupy Midway Island itself. This is the critical, often overlooked, part of the story. Midway wasn't just bait. In Yamamoto's grand design, it was destined to become Japan's unsinkable aircraft carrier, a forward base that would extend their defensive perimeter 1,000 miles to the east. It would become their Pearl Harbor, a dagger pointed at the true heart of American naval power Hawaii. By taking Midway, he wouldn't just win a battle, he would create the permanent logistical and strategic conditions for victory in the Pacific. From the perspective of the ignored warning, the unfolding catastrophe was a perfect storm of dramatic irony. As the Japanese fleet, the largest naval armada in history, steamed towards Midway, their operational orders mirrored the ghost plan of Pearl Harbor with chilling fidelity. The primary objective of the carrier aircraft, the elite pilots of the Kido Butai, was to find and sink the American fleet. But the secondary objective, to be carried out by the invasion force and its supporting ships, was the complete neutralization of Midway as a base. Their target lists included the island's airfield, its power station, its fuel depots. They were going to do to Midway what Nagumo had failed to do to Oahu: tear out its heart, poison the well, and salt the earth. On June 4, 1942, the first act of the drama unfolded exactly as the Japanese had planned. Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, the same commander who had led the strike on Pearl Harbor, launched his first wave of bombers against Midway Island. The American fighters on the island rose to meet them and were swatted from the sky. The anti-aircraft fire was intense, but largely ineffective. The Japanese bombers rained destruction upon the facilities below. The hangars burned. The runways were pockmarked. Black smoke billowed into the morning sky. From the bridge of his flagship Akagi, Nagumo received the report from his strike leader, there is a need for a second attack. This was the moment. This was the critical juncture where history rhymed. Just as he had been at Pearl Harbor, Nagumo was presented with a choice. His planes on the hangar decks below were armed with torpedoes, ready for the moment the American carriers were spotted. But the base on Midway was still a threat. It had to be neutralized. Haunted by the criticism that he had not been aggressive enough in Hawaii, Nagumo gave the fateful order rearm the planes for a second strike on Midway. The torpedoes, meant for ships, were wheeled away. The land attack bombs, the very same ordnance from the Ghost third wave, were brought out. For a solid, excruciating hour, the hangar decks of the Japanese carriers were a chaotic mess of fuel lines, exposed ordnance, and exhausted men, all racing to change the armament for a second, base-destroying strike. They were doubling down on the very strategy Layton and Rockefort had warned about, a strategy that had now made them fatally vulnerable. Because at that exact moment, high above in the scattered clouds, the first American dive bombers from the USS Enterprise were beginning their lonely, desperate plunge. The war ended. The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought a final, terrifying end to the global conflagration. The world moved on, desperate to rebuild, to forget the years of darkness and forge a new future. Histories were written, monuments were built, and the official stories of the great battles hardened into legend. Pearl Harbor became the day of infamy. Midway became the miracle. The narratives were simple, powerful, and clean, perfectly suited for a world weary of complexity. But history is never truly finished. It just lies dormant, waiting in dusty archives and the fading memories of old men. Decades passed. The Cold War rose and fell. And then, in the quiet, climate-controlled rooms of the U.S. National Archives, a new generation of historians began the painstaking work of declassifying the secrets of the Second World War. They opened boxes that had been sealed for half a century, their contents stamped with the ominous red ink of Top Secret Ultra. And inside those boxes, the ghost of the third wave finally began to speak. First came the full, unredacted translations of Japanese operational plans captured after the war. There, in the precise, methodical language of military planning, was the proof. The attacks on Pearl Harbor's infrastructure were not a contingency, they were a core component of the mission, listed as secondary but essential objectives for the strike groups. The documents confirmed what Layton's single captured map had only suggested. The intent was not just to cripple the fleet, but to demolish the base. Then came the interrogations of the surviving Japanese commanders, conducted in Sugamo Prison in 1946. These were not battlefield reports filtered through the fog of war. They were the candid, often bitter, reflections of defeated men. And they told a consistent story. Commander Minoru Jinda, the brilliant architect of the Pearl Harbor attack plan, stated unequivocally that he had argued fiercely with Admiral Nagumo for a third wave. His target, he said, was not the ships, but the oil tank farms. He called Nagumo's failure to launch that strike a catastrophic, war-losing mistake. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, the pilot who led the first wave and sent the famous Tora signal, confirmed it. He told his interrogators that upon his return to the carrier Akagi, he had personally urged Nagumo to launch a third strike to destroy the great oil tanks, which he had seen sitting, completely undefended, on the ridge. The declassified file was now complete. The truth, buried alive by Nimitz in December 1941 for reasons of political and military necessity, was finally, officially, vindicated. Layton and Rockefort had been right. They hadn't been speculative. They hadn't been hysterical. They had seen the enemy's entire grand design with a clarity that had eluded almost everyone else. They understood that the Japanese weren't just warriors, they were logistical vandals who knew that the true sinews of modern warfare were not steel and gunpowder, but oil, wrenches, and dry docks. And in that final, declassified truth lay the ultimate, terrible irony of Midway. Nagumo's decision to rearm his planes for a second strike on the island, the very decision that left his carriers fatally vulnerable to the American dive bombers, was not an act of random panic. It was a direct consequence of the criticism he had endured for his failure to do the exact same thing at Pearl Harbor. The ghost of the third wave, the attack he didn't launch on December 7th, reached out across 5 months of war and haunted him on the bridge of the Akagi. In trying to correct his past mistake, in trying to finally execute the base-destroying strike his subordinates had begged for, he exposed his fleet to utter annihilation. The lesson had been learned too late, and the price of that education was 4 of his finest aircraft carriers, the best of his pilots, and Japan's hope of winning the war. The truth had finally come out, not as a whisper, but as the deafening roar of a world-changing naval victory, forged in the crucible of a mistake the Americans had been lucky to survive, and the Japanese had been doomed to repeat. So now let's zoom out. Let's leave the archives, leave the prison interviews and the declassified files, and look at the whole, terrible, beautiful picture that emerges when the fog finally lifts. This was never just a story about a missed target. It was a story about 2 different ideas of war, colliding in the heart of a single battle. Here's the final War College briefing, the one that makes it all snap into focus. Imagine war is a living body. For centuries, naval warfare was about breaking the bones and tearing the muscle. You fought ship to ship, gun to gun. You destroyed the enemy's strength. This was the American conception of war on December 7th, 1941. They saw their battleships as the fists of the fleet, and they believed the fight was about whose fists were stronger. But the Japanese, particularly planners like Yamamoto and Jinda, understood something new. They understood that the body of modern, globe-spanning warfare has an immune system and a circulatory system, and it was called logistics. They knew you didn't have to break every bone in your enemy's body if you could simply sever their arteries, poison their blood, and shut down their heart. The heart of American power in the Pacific wasn't the fleet, it was the base. The blood was the 4.5 million barrels of oil. The arteries were the supply lines stretching back to California. The immune system was the machine shops and dry docks that could heal the wounded. The attack on Pearl Harbor was meant to be strategic chemotherapy. The sinking of the battleships was just the first, most visible symptom of the treatment. The real cure, the part designed to kill the cancer of American presence in the Pacific, was the third wave. It was an attack on the enemy's ability to wage war itself. And in a single, fateful moment of caution, Admiral Nagumo chose to stop the treatment halfway through. He left the heart beating. He left the blood supply intact. He administered a dose of poison that was painful and disfiguring, but ultimately, survivable. And in that single decision, the entire course of the war was altered. It was Japan's god of war's blind spot. They possessed a revolutionary, war-winning doctrine, the doctrine of logistical annihilation, But the commander at the tip of the spear lacked the conviction to see it through to its terrifying, logical conclusion. Every bizarre clue from our investigation now falls perfectly into place. The strafing of the machine shops wasn't random. The circles on the map weren't a contingency. The missing third wave wasn't a feint. They were all pieces of a single, brilliant, and abandoned idea. The great mystery of Pearl Harbor wasn't why the Americans were caught unprepared for an attack on their ships. The real, enduring mystery is why the Japanese, holding a key that could have locked America out of the Pacific for years, failed to turn it in the lock. The echoes of that failure, and that luck, are still with us. It stands as the ultimate testament to the fog of war, that invisible antagonist that whispers caution into the ear of a bold commander, that hides the enemy's true intention in plain sight, that allows an entire nation to misinterpret the nature of its own survival. The truth, when it finally emerged from the files, was more profound than anyone imagined. America did not win the Pacific War at Midway. It won the war at Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7, 1941, in the mind of a single Japanese admiral who looked at the priceless, undefended heart of his enemy and chose to turn for home.